Revolution, freedom, liberty. 1776 was an event singular in its essence and history. It's a period of new beginnings, then a new government that was shaped by new ideas with tested concepts from Greece to Rome to Babylon and beyond. However, some had more influence on the nation and its concepts than others. And of course, one of these was John Adams. Now, John Adams is mainly known to be the vice president, or the first vice president, and the second president of the United States. Most don't know how much influence he had on the United States and how he shaped what we have today. So, we're going to look at his life, his politics, and actions, and see what we can learn about him. October 30th, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts, John Adams was born to Deacon John Adams and Susanna Boyston. He was born in a small farmhouse right just outside of the city. His family was fifth-generation Adams, who in 1633 had been given a 40-acre land grant by England. John Adams was the oldest of three brothers. He was also the first to attend school. And throughout his childhood, his father played a major influence on his thinking, inspiring him to engage in community affairs, and of course, with thinkers who had a major influence on his ideas later. But for most of his childhood, he grew up working on a farm or attending the community school in Braintree. However, this kind of life was not meant for the character of John Adams. At the age of 15 in 1751, he went to Harvard. This was a task that Adams later reflected on. He was terrified at the thought of introducing himself to such great men as the president and fellows of a college. I am first resolved to return home. Foreseeing the grief of my father, I roused myself, collected resolution enough to proceed. Of course, pushing through his fears, he found something that he could only have hoped for. Harvard was the perfect place for John Adams. It's where he found a lot of his ideas about government, philosophy, and ideas about himself that he never knew existed. He fell in love with learning, became firmly addicted to the entire process, to the point he later remarked, "I perceive a growing curiosity, a love of books, and a fondness for study, which dissipated all my inclinations for sports and even the society of ladies. I read forever." This time he was reading Locke, Spinoza, Milton. But his love was greatest for those in the ancient world. Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, and especially Cicero. But later on, in 1755, he graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts. And after his graduation, he briefly taught at a school in Worcester, Massachusetts, which he found quite boring and he felt isolated. But it was a key point in his life as he ended up meeting the attorney James Putnam, who is the man that influenced him to take a career in law. John studied under Putnam and then returned to Braintree to take the bar exam. And once becoming a lawyer, he was constantly busy trying to break ground in becoming a lawyer and get his name out there, really establish his reputation. But at one of these points in his career, his life would never be the same, and that is when he met the daughter of Parson Smith. While John Adams was pursuing his career in law, he happened to meet a man by the name of Parson William Smith. He became a regular visitor at his residence, and he soon became extremely fond of his daughter, Abigail. At the time, most women were uneducated, having no schooling. However, Abigail was much different. She spent most of her time reading, in which she learned many skills that were most useful in her life to come. When he met Abigail, he was enthralled with her, giving her the nickname of Diana. And this nickname was not without a reason. Her intelligence, her virtue, her strong character, it was exactly what John Adams needed. After many years, and in 1764, they decided to get married and move to the farmland that he inherited from his father, which his father had died in 1761. They lived here for several years. This happens to be where the sixth president was born, John Quincy Adams. During this time, it was a peaceful life. John Adams was pursuing his career in law, traveling from city to city. Him and Abigail would send letters back and forth. He was starting to become a very well-known lawyer, mainly because he was always honest and he was always fair with his trials. But this reputation for being honest and fair would cause one of the most controversial cases in American history and in his own life. On a cold and frozen morning of March 5th, 1777, just after 9 o'clock on King Street, a small commotion over a rumor sprung into the catalyst for the American Revolution. Private Hugh White, overhearing someone saying that his captain, Captain John Goldfinch, had not paid the bill on which he had. He's, of course, standing up for his captain. Things escalated quickly enough that White hit the accuser, Edward Garrick, with the butt of his rifle. The commotion turned into a crowd that ended up growing from 10 people to 50 to almost 400 people. White was surrounded at every turn by colonists. And of course, this caused some great commotion. So the captain of the day, Captain Thomas Preston, decided that White may need backup. And he sent 7 soldiers from the 29th Regiment to back up White. These soldiers, armed with bayonets, were being verbally assaulted, being called lobsters and bloody backs. And also being hit with shells, rocks, anything that the colonists could find to throw at them. And one of the soldiers ended up getting hit in the head, and it discharged his rifle. It was all an accident, but this caused all the other soldiers to end up discharging. It resulted in the death of 5 colonists. This was known as the Boston Massacre. And at the time, it caused immense upheaval from colonists who saw it as British aggression. And just after the Boston Massacre happened, John Adams, at his practice just around the corner, not many blocks away from the actual massacre, received a knock on his door. It was James Forrest, a loyalist, who asked John Adams to defend the very captain, Captain Preston. He decided to take the trial, even if it cost him his reputation. So, during the trial, it lasted 6 days. Both the prosecutor and the defense went off eyewitness testimony. In the very end, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted of murder, while 2 were convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter. Because of this trial, he gained a lot of success for being fair and honest. Although some saw it as controversial, it was a chance to get his name out there. It worked. It did get him in the door to the Massachusetts legislature, which of course would lead to his appointment to the First Continental Congress. As we mentioned before, John Adams, despite his record, was no monarchist. He was no loyalist, and he was definitely and adamantly opposed to the Britain overseeing the colonies. And of course, this is what led him to be appointed to the First Continental Congress. But first, understand there was some events that ramped this feeling up. And it mainly happened through his cousin, Samuel Adams. You see, Samuel Adams and John Adams were different in many ways, but they had the same idea. They wanted the British to leave them alone. They wanted to be their own country, and they wanted to be independent. But they had some variations in their methods of accomplishing this. John Adams was more reserved. He was more focused on the philosophical side, the more intellectual side of things. Samuel Adams was the complete opposite. He could be summed up by a couple of words: attitude, fiery, outspoken, and absolutely boisterous. But at the time, he needed both, and both proved useful. However, prior to John Adams' appointment to the Congress, Samuel Adams and others, on December 16th, 1773, organized the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped 342 chests of tea right into the water to protest the Tea Act. In response, Britain sent warships to block commerce at the Boston Harbor. This was part of the Coercive Act, or the Intolerable Acts. Fear across both sides brought the situation to a breaking point. And in June 1774, John Adams received an invitation to Philadelphia for a meeting of sorts. This was the first meeting of the Continental Congress. This was the connecting of minds that the independence movement and the colonists needed. And later, in July 1775, when the second meeting was in session, the Olive Branch Petition was sent out, mainly authored by John Dickinson. In the Olive Branch Petition, they affirmed their loyalty to the king, but there were certain things that were very controversial and King George did not like. Number one, it was asking to repeal the Intolerable Acts, just like we mentioned before. And it also asked that colonists receive the same rights that British citizens had. Of course, that was the taxation without representation. And this was wholeheartedly ignored by King George. Of course, John Adams was opposed to it from the beginning. He knew what happened. A lot of the founding fathers were against the Olive Branch Petition, but it was at least a final attempt. With the Olive Branch Petition now thrown in the trash, it solidified what had to be done. It was time to break from Britain. It was time to claim our independence. Almost a year later, the Continental Congress was in full spin. Independence was closer than ever. John Adams, Ben Franklin, and others were tasked with being the drafters of a declaration from Britain written by Thomas Jefferson. It was finished in June, but now there were delays. Richard Henry Lee offered the Lee Resolution, calling for the free and independent states. This debate was intense. However, on July 1st, one man changed the tide of this debate. Adams took the floor, as he had done many times. This time, it would lead to the formation of the United States. His speech was impeccable. Thomas Jefferson described it as not graceful nor elegant, nor remarkably fluent, but he spoke with power of thought and expression that moved us out of our seats. It had been John Adams who had brought the stars to where they must be seated. And on July 2nd, the vote was cast, aligning 13 stars to create the country we know today. Yes, our Independence Day is actually July 2nd. John Adams even wrote to his wife, "The most memorable day in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival." However, it ended up being July 4th. And the funny thing is, most of the founding fathers didn't even really do anything on July 4th. It's funny that it got shifted that way, but anyhow, after a long and grueling year as a Massachusetts delegate during 1777, he became ill and stepped down from his post. The work was excruciating. However, he returned to the Congress in 1778 for an important mission. He was to go to France to help Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee with an allegiance with the French. On a cold day in February, he set sail on the Boston with his 10-year-old son, John Quincy Adams. Considering the voyage, Adams was not in a very eager mood. He wrote down, "I suppose I bid farewell to my native shore, perhaps forever." The voyage ran into many problems. The whole crew and everyone became sick, ran into two British ships and outrunning them. Then there was a terrible storm that lasted almost 3 days. Nevertheless, they prevailed. John Adams was glad, but he was most proud of the way his son handled himself. He wrote, "The child's behavior gave me a satisfaction that I cannot express, but they would run into one more problem. That would be another British ship. And this time, they wouldn't be able to outrun him. They'd have to fight him." The ship fired its cannons, and so did the Boston. During this time, the captain, Samuel Tucker, was surprised to see John Adams with a musket in his hand. And he asked, "My dear sir, how came you here?" We're basically asking in modern words, "Why are you out here?" And he said, "I ought to do my share of fighting," Adams replied. John Adams fought with the men to take the ship. A future president just won his first naval battle. So, once they had reached France, there was some controversy. Benjamin Franklin had already made a pact with France. And this kind of set a tone with Adams that would kind of play out through their relationship over the decades. Because now that he had already created a pact with France, he kind of limited his role. And he was kind of set idle in France. This was one of many problems. While he was in Paris, he seemed appalled by the differences in culture between America and France. As John Adams was like the idealistic version of American culture. He was traditional, was very reserved, had certain values about him. The French were very boisterous, very different, very just the complete opposite of what John Adams was. They were not blunt at all. Of course, he was very appalled by this. And this was also the difference between him and Franklin at the time. Franklin was more diplomatic, avoidant of conflict, and able to charm the entire nation. The exact opposite of Adams. Now, this point was a bit of jealousy for Adams. However, he did believe that Franklin was too generous with the French. And this was the main reason that there was such a division between them. And this caused so many problems that by 1779, Congress decided to call back Adams from France, believing Franklin was the only commissioner needed for that moment. Returning, he was deeply angry, vowing he would never do anything in the political world again. And of course, we know how that went. After returning to Congress, they decided to send him back again, without him even wanting the post, might I add. And the second time around was a little worse than the last time. During his second stay, you would think that he wouldn't be so blunt with the French. This time he doubled down. He was much more heavy-handed with dealing with the French, which of course did not go over well at all. At this time he believed that France wanted to help, but not too much as to make America powerful enough to stand on its own. His words sum this up perfectly. Although I am convinced by everything I see and read and hear that all the powers of Europe, except perhaps the House of Austria, and I am not very clear in that exception, rejoice in the American Revolution, and consider the independence of America as for their interest and happiness. And in many points of view, both respecting commerce and the balance of Europe, yet I have many reasons to think that not one of them, not even Spain or France, wishes to see America rise very fast to power. We ought therefore to be cautious how we magnify our ideas, exaggerate our expressions of generosity, magnanimity of any of these powers. Let us treat them with gratitude, but with dignity. Let us remember what is due to ourselves and our prosperity, as well as to them. He was afraid that France was just using America to weaken Britain. They had, my God, the French and British have fought for, it feels like, forever. So that's what it kind of felt like. It felt like a chess piece more than an actual lending hand from France. This opinion did not sit with Franklin very well. Congress slowly moved him out. And this was with the influence of Franklin behind them. Slowly, Congress moved John Adams back out of France again. Franklin believed if we were to win France over, he had to be a little more diplomatic. But to this point, there was no effect. Everything France had sent over was not seeming to be helpful. They're beginning to change their minds on the subject of our independence. The task had to be handled with care. As Franklin told Adams earlier, he must deal with the French court with decency and delicacy, which did not fit with Adams's blunt style. So by then, the French Foreign Minister, Vergennes, sent Franklin a letter that he would not deal with Adams anymore, removing any power he had as a commissionary. Reluctantly, Franklin sent the letters to Congress, which cut a deep wedge in between John Adams and Franklin even more. He was now idle in Paris. He desperately wanted to at least accomplish something on his trip to Europe. So he set his sights somewhere else. Later in July of 1780, John Adams left for the Netherlands. He had failures in Paris. He was now in the Netherlands. He did one of the most important things that happened in our country. He drafted the Constitution of Massachusetts. This was in 1780, and he did draft it in 1779, but it became in effect in 1780, and it is now the oldest constitution still in effect. So he did at least accomplish something while he was in the Netherlands, or that transitional period between Paris and the Netherlands. And this was mainly to gain financial support that the American cause needed. His main mission was to gather support for the new republic. He found it extremely difficult when he was there. During 1780, the Dutch were hesitant about supporting the new nation. They did not want to stand against Britain. And on top of that, the war in the South was going all wrong. Charleston was taken. General Horatio Gates lost horrifically in Camden. It was a dark period for the fight of freedom. But Adams persisted. He gathered as much support from noblemen, bankers, politicians, anyone willing to support the cause. However much the Dutch admired his work ethic, they had little to no confidence in the American Revolution. It took an extreme toll on his health. He suffered what he called a nervous fever of a dangerous kind, bordering upon putrid. He was sick for almost 6 weeks. However, he was able to fully recover and continue his work. Later during that time, later in November, came the news from across the seas. On Friday, November 19th, 1781, in Yorktown, Virginia, General Cornwallis had surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. In London, Lord North, the British Prime Minister, exclaimed, "Oh God, it's over!" Still in feeble health, John Adams could not have received better news. He was absolutely ecstatic. He knew now that the Dutch loan was in closer grips. So finally, on April 19th, 1782, received a loan of 5 million guilders, which was at least worth 2 million pounds at the time. And today, that'd be approximately 300 to 500 million US dollars. But also, with the loan, it was the second country to officially recognize the independence of America. However, that's not everything that happened in 1782. We went back to Paris to meet with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay to discuss peace terms with Britain. However, Benjamin Franklin showed his true card. While they were in Paris, the French asked for specific guidelines between the peace of America and Britain. These were completely ignored. And they did this because they wanted a better deal with Britain. They completely cut out the French, but it wasn't signed until 1783. And this didn't go very well with the French. And we'll see what happens later with this. But for now, American independence was secured. So, after wartime, it seemed to be an interesting time for John Adams. In August of 1784 to May 1785, he lived in a town near Paris with Abigail, often spending time with Jefferson and doing other things. And then later in 1885, he moved to the Netherlands and then to London, being the first foreign minister to the British court, being the first founding father to actually meet King George. However much King George still had a little bit of anger towards the United States. But after such dealings in Europe, he returned home in 1788. Try to live a life peaceful away from politics on his farm in Braintree. But as we know with Adams, that could not happen. On April 21st, 1789, he was elected vice president, serving under George Washington. During this time, the man who received the most votes was the president. The man who received the second most votes was the vice president. But his time as vice president had some major ups and downs. But even from the very start, He saw the vice presidency as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Basically, at the time, the vice president just presided over the Senate, and he basically cast the tie-breaking votes when they had major decisions, and they were like a 50-50. He'd be like the 51 vote. His opinion was even more solidified by Washington, who Adams wished he took his counsel more, but ended up making more decisions on the advice of Hamilton and others. He felt isolated. He wanted to be more important, but the other members of government were making sure he didn't. They went as far as to mock him. One of the debates about policy, about what to call the president. Yes, they were debating about what to call the president. Adams insisted they call the president His Majesty. And of course, considering what just happened a couple of years ago, Adams's time spent in London, they didn't find this very good. And they started to give him the nickname of His Rotundity. So you can tell by his vice presidency that it was not the best. However, one perk of the VP status is that it sets you up for the highest seat in the land. In 1796, Adams ran for presidency against Thomas Jefferson, and he won. Alexander Hamilton, commenting on this, worried that Adams was too vain, opinionated, and too stubborn to heed any advice from the Federalist leaders like himself. Preferred someone more like Thomas Pinckney, rather than that hard-headed Adams. However, Adams' view was no less harsh of Hamilton either. He judged Hamilton to be a proud-spirited and conceited, and an inspiring mortal always pretending to morality. The hostility between the men shaped a lot of Federalist policies throughout his presidency, and even the next election. However, we're going to look at that later. We're going to look at his presidency overall. First off, his administration and presidency was controversial to say the least. During the 4 years, he ran into problem after problem, but mainly is with foreign issues, one of which was dealing with the French. Years earlier, Washington had signed the Jay Treaty. This was mainly to uphold peace with Britain, settling things like trade and post-revolutionary problems, like British soldiers still being on American soil. Of course, this was signed in 1794 and it was effected in 1796. And this did not sit well with the French whatsoever. It enraged them, and in return, they ended up stealing American cargo, ships, and kidnapping American sailors. This was a very controversial time. So Adams, in 1796, sent over American commissioners to negotiate terms with the French. And as soon as they got there, Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, demanded bribes from the Americans. This did not go over well whatsoever. This was seen as an insult, and it absolutely enraged America at this time. It put France and America deathly close to a war. Even Washington, who always took a neutral stance in European affairs or about countries, said he would come back out of retirement to kick some French ass. This was known as the XYZ affair. Yes, I know what you're thinking. What kind of stupid name is that for a name? Like, who thought of this? So, during this time, John Adams built up defenses. Building up the American military, which looked very good in the public eye. Of course, later, he sent diplomats back over, and we ended up avoiding the war with France. This was one of the best things he did as a president. However, there's a lot of things that were still disastrous. Party management to the policies like the Alien and Sedition Act, which violated free speech laws, were not so good. And it cost him the election in 1800 against Jefferson. All the things that Hamilton had said, him being too vain, him being too impetuous, too hard-headed, it all came to light. It cost him the election. However, I'm not going to gloss over what he did that was good as a president. One of which was establishing the Department of the Navy. After the Revolutionary War, the Navy was disbanded, but he signed it back and brought it back. He also signed the Federal Bankruptcy Act of 1800, which protected debtors much more than they previously had been. He also established the Library of Congress. He did a lot of good things, but the bad was too much. It ended up costing him the election. Jefferson had beat him. It ended his political career. It wasn't a good time. He was very bitter about it. He was bitter. It soured his relationship with Jefferson until 1812, when it eventually healed. In 1800, he left the White House in despair. He wrote his friend Cotton Tufts, "The only question remaining with me is what shall I do with myself? Something I must do, or anew will rain on me in buckets." However, this bitterness wouldn't last. During his time in retirement, him and Abigail enjoyed a life away from politics. A life of peace they had not felt since the early days. It was spent in the company of his children and grandchildren, and John Adams seemed to be in vigorous health. He was exercising, he was still doing farm work. Time had to take its course. Until in 1818, Abigail fell into ill health. John stayed with her, by her side. It was her time. She remarked to him, "Do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend. I'm ready to go." And John, it will not be long. On October 18th, 1880, she died. According to her son Thomas, she was seemingly conscious until her last breath. John Adams was trembling so horribly that he couldn't even stand. It was an agonizing time. After he buried his wife, during the final years of his life, he was still able to gain some happiness. He saw his son rise to politics, and even becoming the 6th president. He wrote back and forth to his friends, mainly to Thomas Jefferson. It seemed to be a peaceful life. He lived to an old age, to the point where he couldn't even read or write. It got so bad. Finally, after such a peaceful life, in 1826, on July 4th, John Adams died of a heart attack, with his last words being, "Thomas Jefferson survives," unaware that Thomas Jefferson had died earlier that morning. John Adams was buried beside his wife at United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts. His epitaph that he wished he had, as he wrote, was, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. Obviously, that wouldn't be the greatest epitaph for one of the founding fathers. Instead, to this day, it reads, "Signer of the Declaration of Independence, framer of the Constitution of Massachusetts, and 2nd President of the United States." And with the celebration of independence came the celebration of life for 2 founding fathers, who both died on the Independence Day. This was a coincidence. It happens one time in history. Hope you enjoyed the video on John Adams. I had a good time reading and researching all this. A lot to uncover, a lot to do. I wanted to keep this video a little bit shorter, and it was fun. Mainly based it off of the biography, one of the best biographies I've ever read about John Adams. But yeah, I wanted to keep it a little bit shorter, or try to at least. I wanted to add in the detail, and I mainly covered his life during the Revolution. I just kind of wanted to highlight points of him after. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.